Welcome to Module 6 of the GRR Technical Training Series. Module Aim and Reminders. This module discusses the remaining technical requirements of the GRR not specifically covered in other modules. These requirements are Requirement R8, Site Characterisation and Monitoring, Requirement R14, Protection of the Environment, and Requirement R15, Protection against non-radiological hazards. This is the 6th GRR technical training module out of 8 in total. Before we discuss these requirements in more detail, it is worth just reminding ourselves about a few basic points. The GRR stands for the Management of Radioactive Waste from Decommissioning of Nuclear Sites, Guidance on Requirements for Release from Radioactive Substances Regulation, which was published in July 2018. The guidance is available on the SEPA website and can also be accessed via a summary on gov.uk. We use the term Radioactive Substances Regulation to cover the relevant legislation which is different in Scotland from that in England and Wales. Although the legislation differs in detail, it shares common aims. We have written the GRR to fulfil those aims. Finally, please remember that the GRR applies to all stages of a nuclear site's life cycle, and that all the requirements of the GRR need to be addressed for the final surrender of a site's permit. GRR structure. This slide is a reminder of how the GRR is structured. Requirements are grouped into technical requirements and management requirements. If the operator's plans for decommissioning and cleanup meet the requirements, then the 5 principles will be satisfied, and consequently, the fundamental protection objective of the GRR will be achieved. There are a total of 9 technical requirements, shown in purple in this figure. Requirement R13, Optimization of On-Site Disposals, was covered in Module 2 of this technical training series. Requirement R7, Site-Wide Environmental Safety Case, was covered in Module 4. Requirements R9 to R12 give our numerical standards and were covered in Module 5. As already mentioned, this module will cover the remaining technical requirements, R8, R14 and R15. Technical requirements R8, R14 and R15. Before we cover each requirement in more detail, let us just remind ourselves of their overall objectives. Requirement R8, Site Characterisation and Monitoring, stipulates that operators should undertake a programme of site characterisation and monitoring to provide information to underpin their waste management plan and site-wide environmental safety case, or SWESC. Requirement R14, Protection of the Environment, states that operators must assess radiological effects on non-human organisms and demonstrate that the natural environment will be protected both during and after radioactive substances regulation. And Requirement R15, Protection against non-radiological hazards, states that operators must assess any non-radiological hazards associated with the radioactive waste or contamination and demonstrate that people and the environment are protected both during and after radioactive substances regulation. Requirement R8. Now we will go into more detail about Requirement R8, which states that operators should carry out a programme of site characterisation and monitoring to provide information needed to support the waste management plan and SWESC. Such a programme has several different objectives. 1. To establish background levels of radioactivity. Sufficient information will be required to estimate background radioactivity present at the site, including naturally occurring radioactivity and radioactivity arising from previously authorised discharges to the environment, from historic activities such as atmospheric weapons testing and past nuclear accidents. 2. To identify radioactive hazards on the site. Characterisation data will be required for the radioactive waste that arises and to identify the extent of any contamination on the site. Where appropriate, monitoring of radioactivity that has escaped and is migrating in the environment may also be required. 3. To support ongoing demonstration of compliance during radioactive substances regulation. During the period of regulation, radiological monitoring provides the information for operators to demonstrate compliance with the limits and conditions of the permit, and in turn show that members of the public are protected from radiological hazards. 4. To validate modelling assumptions. The programme should include validation monitoring during the period of regulation to provide evidence that the behaviour of radioactive substances on or adjacent to the site is consistent with the assumptions used in the SWESC. 5. To identify if corrective actions are required. Monitoring should be carried out after the completion of all planned work involving radioactive substances. In the event that unexpected levels of radioactivity are observed, the monitoring should then trigger an action plan to address the situation. Site characterisation. Site characterisation should be proportionate and tailored to establishing the requisite understanding of the site characteristics. Sufficient information will be required to establish the background levels of radioactivity at the site location. Characterisation to support the SWESC should include, but not necessarily be limited to, the geological and hydrogeological properties of the site, including the potential for and effect of dynamic geological processes that may be significant to the SWESC, the resource potential of the area under and near the site, in order to assess the extent to which the area may be disturbed in the future through exploitation of the resources, the nature, magnitude, and distribution of radiological hazards on or adjacent to the site, the nature, magnitude, and distribution of any non-radiological hazards associated with or potentially interacting with the radiological hazards, past and present rates of movement and diffusion of these hazards, if, for example, transported by groundwater, so that extrapolations can be made into the future. The biosphere, including considerations of soils, flora and fauna distributions, and human settlement patterns and activities. Characterisation and monitoring of the biosphere should be sufficiently comprehensive to support dose assessments during the period of radioactive substances regulation, and should be sufficient to support the assumptions made in the SWESC for assessing risks after release from regulation. The detail to which these site characteristics are established will be driven by the information needs of the SWESC and should be proportionate to the risks that are being assessed. Monitoring disposals of waste. During the period of regulation, operators must continue to carry out radiological monitoring and assessment to demonstrate compliance with the permit conditions and provide assurance of radiological protection to members of the public. Where there are on-site disposals of solid radioactive waste, or contamination is managed on the site, this monitoring will provide data to verify that the behaviour of the radioactive substances is consistent with the assessments made in the SWESC. Monitoring programmes will need to be regularly reviewed as decommissioning progresses, and the nature and location of releases to the environment change. Monitoring programmes should have a clear rationale and should be reasoned and proportionate. An important part of the monitoring programme is that it should clearly specify levels of specific contaminants that will trigger action, as well as establish an action plan if these levels are breached. The action plan should include an approach for identifying any false positive readings before unnecessary action is taken. In accordance with Principle 4 of the GRR, unreasonable reliance should not be placed on human action to protect people and the environment after release from radioactive substances regulation. This means that assurance of environmental safety should not depend on monitoring or surveillance after the end of regulation. Further guidance. Further guidance is available to assist in defining the monitoring programme. For example, the Radiological Monitoring Technical Guidance Note 2 on Environmental Radiological Monitoring, jointly published by SEPA, FSA and EA. Environment Agency Guidance on Monitoring of Landfill Leachate, Groundwater and Surface Water, and the Nuclear Industry Group for Land Quality, Nuclear Industry Code of Practice for Routine Water Quality Monitoring. All of these are available online. Requirement R14. Requirement R14 aims to ensure that all aspects of the environment are protected, including non-human organisms. It states that operators shall assess the radiological effects of this site on the environment with a view to showing that all aspects of the environment are adequately protected, both during the period of and after release from radioactive substances regulation. There are a range of statutory provisions related to habitats, biodiversity, and conservation matters that the environment agencies need to take account of under radioactive substances regulation. We will only authorise disposals and release sites from regulation when we are satisfied that these provisions are met. For example, the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations 2010 requires us to make an appropriate assessment of the implications of any proposals for a site's conservation objective. We expect operators to carry out assessments of the effects of their proposals on the environment, paying particular attention to any effects on designated conservation areas on or near the site. These assessments should form a part of the SWESC, with their extent and complexity proportionate to the radiological hazards presented by the site. Assessing impacts on non-human organisms. Discharges and migration of radionuclides on or from a nuclear site may have a detrimental effect on non-human organisms, including from ground or groundwater affected by contamination. There are currently no statutory criteria for determining radiological protection of the environment. Some criteria have been recommended by the IAEA and ICRP, and a number of regulatory guidance documents have proposed criteria and assessment approaches. You can find references to these documents in paragraph A4-100 of the GRR. When making our own assessments of radiological impacts on non-human organisms, we use the ERICA tool, which stands for Environmental Risk from Ionizing Contaminants, Assessment and Management. We use simple conservative assumptions and a dose rate screening criterion of 10 microgray per hour to undertake an initial assessment of the dose rates from a single premises on non-human organisms in designated conservation sites, for example, sites of special scientific interest, special areas of conservation, and special protected areas. If the calculated dose rates do not exceed this screening criterion, we would not expect populations of non-human organisms and their habitats to be adversely affected by the released radioactivity. However, if the screening criterion is exceeded, we would then use more site-specific data in the ERICA model to generate more realistic assessments. Requirement R15. Requirement R15 states that operators should also protect people and the environment from any non-radiological hazards associated with the radioactive substances that remain on site both during the period of and after release from radioactive substances regulation. This requirement refers to any potentially harmful non-radioactive properties of the radioactive substances remaining on the site. For example, radioactive waste may also be chemically toxic or may contain asbestos. In some instances, the non-radiological hazards may be greater or more persistent than the radiological hazards. The level of protection should be consistent with that provided by the national standards applicable at the time. Whilst there are a range of national assessment approaches and standards for non-radiological hazards, these approaches may not be suitable to apply directly to radioactive wastes. Therefore, we require that an equivalent level of protection against non-radiological hazards should be demonstrated. This requirement for equivalence in the level of protection from non-radiological hazards, whilst not necessarily requiring the same numerical standard to be achieved, is given in Principle 3 of the GRR. In accordance with Principle 3, we do not expect operators to take account of non-radiological hazards in their assessment of inadvertent human intrusion for requirements R11, since there is no regulatory requirement to assess the disruption by human action of conventional waste landfills after their closure and surrender of their permit. Protection of people and the environment against non-radiological hazards associated with any radioactive substances on or adjacent to the site should be demonstrated in the SWESC. We also expect that non-radioactive hazards could be an important factor in optimization assessments under requirements R1 and R13. Please note that if the non-radiological hazards of the site persist beyond the radiological hazards, the site will continue to be regulated under an appropriate permit. We will not leave a site unregulated if there are hazards remaining. Next steps. This module has covered the 3 technical requirements not specifically covered in other modules in this series. These were Requirement R8, Site Characterisation and Monitoring, Requirement R14, Protection of the Environment, and Requirement R15, Protection against non-radiological hazards. While all training modules are designed to be viewed independently, we suggest that Module 7, Other Management Requirements, is viewed next. Thank you.